August 7th, 1944. 5:12 in the morning. The sun had not yet risen. The hills of Mortagne, in northern France, were still cloaked in mist and the low hum of dread. In the valley below, 3 American units, 2 infantry platoons, and 1 light artillery detachment were caught like fish in a net. They had fallen back into what they thought was a defensive pocket. Instead, it became a death trap. German panzer divisions were closing in from 2 sides. Machine gun fire echoed through the fog, and the radio crackled with one final order from headquarters: "Hold your position. Do not engage. Reinforcements en route." Inside his M4 Sherman tank, Lieutenant Carl Hartmann stared at the smoke shell in his hand. It was not meant to be fired. Not now. Not without approval. The manual called it wasteful. Command called it unauthorized. But the men out there, his men, were running out of time. If the Germans completed their encirclement, they would all be slaughtered or captured before sunrise. Hartmann's heart pounded as he looked to his gunner. "Just 1 shot," he said quietly. "That's all we need." And in that moment, with no orders, no backup, and no guarantee, he pulled the trigger on the smoke round that would either end his career or save over 200 lives. Lieutenant Carl Hartmann was not born for war. If you had asked him in 1939 what he planned to do with his life, he would have said something about building bridges. He was a third-year engineering student at the University of Michigan, obsessed with blueprints and the mechanical harmony of steel and concrete. But then the war came. After Pearl Harbor in December 1941, Hartmann enlisted, not because he wanted to fight, but because he couldn't imagine not doing something. He volunteered for the Armored Corps because he trusted machines more than people. By the summer of 1944, Hartmann was in Normandy, France, just weeks after D-Day. He was 24 years old and in command of a Sherman tank crew attached to the 30th Infantry Division, known as Old Hickory. They had been pushing German forces back toward Paris, but the German High Command wasn't ready to give up. In early August, Field Marshal Gunther von Kluge ordered Operation Lüttich, a surprise counterattack meant to cut through American lines and trap Allied forces in Normandy. The main blow was aimed at Mortagne, a sleepy hillside town with strategic roads leading in 5 directions. The Americans had just established a fragile front near Mortagne. Hartmann's tank detachment, a platoon from Company K, and a forward artillery observer team were ordered to hold a ridgeline just southwest of the town. The orders were simple: hold and wait. But war does not wait. On the night of August 6th, under cover of darkness and thick fog, German armor began to push forward. By early morning on August 7th, the Americans on the ridge realized they were no longer holding the high ground. They were in a low pocket, being surrounded. The radios buzzed with panic. German tanks had cut the western road. Infantry was moving up from the south. To the north, artillery pounded any American unit that tried to reposition. There was no exit left, only the choking feeling that something had gone very, very wrong. Inside the Sherman, Hartmann tried to keep his crew calm. He had his gunner, Private First Class Earl Bishop, a quiet farm boy from Iowa. His loader, Corporal James Ortega, who had a knack for poker and explosives. His driver, Specialist Anthony Vitelli from Brooklyn, who swore like a sailor and drove like a daredevil. And his radio operator, Private George Marks, a 19-year-old from Missouri who hadn't spoken a full sentence in 2 days. They were not heroes. They were not commandos. They were 5 young men inside 33 tons of steel, with a 75mm gun and a handful of shells, including one thing they were told never to use without explicit permission: a single, white, phosphorus smoke round.
German armor was moving fast. Intelligence had underestimated the counterattack speed. Command had gone silent for the past 10 minutes. The only message Hartmann received was, "Do not engage unless fired upon. Hold your ground." But that ground was shrinking by the minute. Hartmann could see American infantry retreating toward his tank from the woods. Some were wounded. One carried another on his back. They were all headed toward a road that no longer existed, cut off by German forces that were almost within visual range. Hartmann looked down at the shell marked SMK, smoke, white phosphorus. His hand hovered over it for just a second. What he was about to do would not follow protocol, but neither, he thought, would dying in a circle of burning tanks. By 5:30 that morning, visibility remained under 200 yards. Trees loomed like ghosts. Every crunch of gravel sounded like a tank track. The men of Company K were now fully exposed. German forces had taken control of the western road during the night, sealing off the only natural retreat path. Hartmann listened to the chatter on the radio. It was chaos. One call came from a forward artillery observer. "We're getting hit from the south, multiple vehicles, requesting fire support." Another voice screamed, "They're in the trees! I repeat, they are inside the tree line." Command's response was chillingly calm. Negative on fire support. Risk of friendly fire too high. Maintain position. Reinforcements in transit. Through his periscope, Hartmann saw movement in the tree line. "Panzers, 2 o'clock," he said. 3, maybe 4 of them, closing in. Then came the first blast. A German shell ripped into the position held by the artillery observers 200 yards south. Fireballs and screams followed. "Return fire!" Hartmann yelled. Bishop squeezed the trigger. The Sherman's gun barked. One of the Panzers caught the shell squarely and erupted in flames. The others scattered and returned fire. The tank rocked violently. Outside, American infantry were already moving, retreating in clusters, dragging wounded, shouting for medics. There was no formation, no command structure left. German troops began to emerge from the south slope. Machine guns opened up. Men fell. Hartmann could see it clearly now. In less than 10 minutes, the enemy would close the southern pincer. That would complete the encirclement. If that happened, no one on the ridge would get out. His hands clenched the hatch. He scanned the terrain. Then something caught his eye. Wind. The smoke from the burning Panzer was drifting westward, toward the German lines, slowly, steadily. "Ortega," Hartmann said, "you still got that smoke shell?" "The phosphorus one?" "Yes, sir, but we're not authorized." "I know what the manual says." Hartmann turned to the rest of the crew. "We're going to buy them a chance. One shot. We fire that shell west, create a wall of smoke. They might not see what's moving through it. If they hesitate just for a minute, we can get those guys out." Tony raised an eyebrow. "What if they don't hesitate?" Hartmann met his eyes. "Then we buy time. Nothing more." There was a long pause. Then Ortega nodded. "Loading white phosphorus." As the loader slammed the shell into place, Bishop adjusted the elevation. Hartmann opened the hatch just a crack and watched the battlefield. Wounded soldiers crawling, others trying to drag radios or crates of ammunition, and behind them, death coming on steel tracks. He whispered, more to himself than anyone else, "Let's make some noise."
"Fire!" he said. The gun recoiled with a thump. The white phosphorus shell screamed out of the barrel and detonated mid-air just 50 yards west of their position. Within seconds, thick gray smoke began to pour into the field like a curtain descending on a stage. The wind, mercifully steady, pushed it directly toward the German approach route. The battlefield changed instantly. The Germans, seeing the sudden wall of opaque smoke, ceased their advance. Tanks halted, infantry paused. Through binoculars, they could see almost nothing. American movement became invisible. And that invisibility, however temporary, was enough. "Move!" Hartman shouted into the radio. "All units west, now! Use the smoke! Go!" On the ridge, the scattered American units got the message. Infantrymen leapt from cover and began sprinting toward the western slope. Medics grabbed stretchers. Artillery crews abandoned their gear, grabbing rifles and dragging each other through the haze. From the German perspective, the battlefield had gone dark. The sudden appearance of smoke, right as American forces began to vanish from sight, raised alarms. Some German commanders feared a counterattack. Others thought it was cover for incoming artillery or an aerial strike. In reality, it was nothing more than 5 men inside a tank, gambling on wind direction and fear. For 90 seconds, nothing moved. And in those 90 seconds, the bulk of the remaining American forces on that ridge vanished into the smoke and made it to the rear line. Then suddenly, a shot rang out. A German machine gun opened fire from the left flank, spraying into the smoke. Panicked, a second gun joined in. Hartman made a snap decision. Return fire, suppression only. Bishop obeyed. The Sherman roared again, firing into the thicket where muzzle flashes danced. The result? A fireball, smoke, more chaos. The Germans halted again, unwilling to rush into what might be a full American defense. Behind the smoke screen, nearly 200 American soldiers slipped away. The gamble had worked. At first, no one moved. The smoke rolled across the field like a living thing. To some soldiers, it looked like a trap. To others, it looked like hope wrapped in gray. Then someone yelled, "They're covering us! Go! Move!" That was all it took. The entire ridge erupted into motion. Dozens of American infantrymen broke from cover and sprinted west into the fog. Some limped, some carried wounded over their shoulders. The smoke was thick, acrid, and burned their lungs. But it also gave them the one thing they hadn't felt since dawn, a chance. One by one, squads slipped into the veil, and Hartman Sherman sat right at the edge of it, the last visible guardian before the void. A group of artillery spotters passed the Sherman, coughing. One of them banged on the side of the tank. "Nice trick, boys. You just bought us our skins." Then came the last of them, a squad from Company K, moving slower, carrying 2 badly wounded on makeshift stretchers. One man waved frantically to Hartman. "They're closing in! You have to go now!" Hartman nodded. He waited just long enough to see the final man disappear into the mist. "Tony," he said to his driver, "punch it. We're the last ones out." The tank lurched forward, pushing west into the smoke trail they had created themselves. 3 minutes later, they reached the edge of the smoke. And there, just beyond the last ridge, they saw it. The American fallback line. Dozens of men huddled behind trucks, sandbags, and makeshift barricades. Medics rushed from person to person. It wasn't pretty, but it was safety. As the Sherman crested the hill and came into view, a cheer erupted. "They made it! Tanks still rolling!" Behind them, the smoke still billowed, buying precious seconds more. A few more stragglers emerged, coughing and bleeding, but alive.
The encirclement had failed. The Germans had hesitated, and in that hesitation, the Americans had slipped away. All because of one shot, one forbidden shell. The formal review came 5 days later. It was held inside a requisitioned schoolhouse that served as temporary divisional headquarters. Hartman arrived in a clean uniform, boots polished, eyes straight. The board consisted of 3 officers, They asked Hartman to recount in exact detail what had occurred on the morning of August 7th and why he had chosen to deploy a forbidden white phosphorus round. Hartman told them everything without embellishment, without apology. He concluded simply, "I believed the smoke would delay the enemy long enough for our people to escape, and it did." There was a long pause. The legal officer spoke first. "Lieutenant Hartman, are you aware that in other circumstances the unauthorized use of white phosphorus could be grounds for disciplinary action?" "Yes, sir, fully aware." Finally, a combat veteran leaned forward. His uniform bore a silver star. "I read every after-action report. You knew the risks and you still made the call. You gambled and you won. That takes more than guts. That takes judgment." He turned to the others. "I recommend no reprimand." There was no objection. Word spread fast. Within a week, officers from 3 different units requested after-action briefings from Hartman. His decision, once considered reckless, was being studied. By early September, a quiet directive circulated among armored units. In certain circumstances, smoke deployment could be authorized at the discretion of field commanders. The rules had changed, slightly, but significantly. In November, Hartman received a small envelope. He had been awarded the Bronze Star from meritorious service. There was no ceremony, no photographer. The medal was handed to him at a quartermaster's desk along with a form to sign. Later that night, Ortega asked, "You going to tell your folks back home about it?" Hartman shrugged. They'd probably ask what took them so long. It was not the kind of glory people read about in newspapers. There were no parades. But among the men who had walked through that smoke curtain and lived, Hartman's name became something more than a rank. It became trust. And in war, trust was rarer than medals. After the war, Hartman returned to the University of Michigan, finished his engineering degree, and eventually took a job designing vehicle safety systems for a Detroit automobile company. Ironically, the man who once bent the rules to save soldiers with smoke would go on to create structural innovations that saved thousands of lives in car accidents. He rarely talked about the war. When asked by his children what it was like, he simply said, "Loud, fast, and full of choices you don't get to make twice." Years later, at age 62, recently retired, Carl Hartman wrote a letter to his younger sister. In it, tucked between memories of childhood summers and talk of car engines, was a passage he never shared with anyone else. August 7, 1944. "I can still smell the smoke. Not the burning kind, the kind that hides you, that wraps around you like a second chance. I wasn't supposed to use it. We were supposed to hold the line, follow orders, die like good soldiers if needed. But something about watching those men out there, scared, bleeding, still trying to carry each other, I just couldn't let them die for the sake of protocol. That day the battlefield taught me something no manual ever could, that sometimes the only right choice is the one they didn't teach you to make." The letter was found years after his passing. His family chose to donate it to the U.S. Army Heritage and Education Center, where it now sits in a display titled "Split-Second Decisions, Tactical Genius in the Field." There are no statues of Carl Hartman, no documentaries, no best-selling memoirs. But somewhere in a quiet archive sits the testimony of a man who changed the course of a battle with a single unauthorized act of judgment. And maybe that's the real lesson, that sometimes history doesn't remember you for what you were ordered to do, but for what you chose to do when no one else would.